Sir, very much there. Sorry.
Uh, Greetings, everyone. I'm going to start with your permission. Um, a very, very warm welcome on behalf of the Indian Institute of, Public Policy for this discussion, which is very timely. I think we will all agree. It is of an importance which can hardly be exaggerated. A very special welcome and thank you especially to our panel of experts, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Professor Raja Mohan, Ambassadors Mohan Kumar, Rajiv Bhatia, Neelam Sabharwal, Professor Alka Acharya, Mr. J. Ranade, Mr. Harsh Pant, and many participants who are joining us as we go along. They're all our panelists are very well known. They need no introduction. All of them have been sharing their thinking in various fora on different perspectives of this multifaceted challenge, which much of the world increasingly recognizes needs to be confronted head on, which is the subject of today's discussion. For me to try and introduce the subject when there is this galaxy of experts to educate us in depth and on all important aspects would be like carrying coal to Newcastle, as one used to say in the old days. So suffice it to say that these days lines are being drawn with increasing clarity at the level of individual countries and also at the level of groups of countries um, on facing this challenge. So you have the US, France, Germany, UK, the EU, G7, NATO, Australia, Japan, all to be on board. May I request everyone to mute their microphones, please? Thank you. They all seem to be on board with hardly any ifs and buts, which used to be punctuating their expressions of support earlier. On the face of it, these developments could be of very, very great potential geopolitical and geoeconomic significance. The hows are also falling in place with specific projects being agreed. So you have the Build Back Better World, the B3W to counter BRI, and the EU has just announced a globally connected Europe. There is a lot of new energy and quite a few high-level commitments within the Indo-Pacific, in the Quad, and various other groupings and subgroupings. India's policies too have undoubtedly gained in clarity and direction, from standing up firmly against China's territorial claims to explicit support for the core, if understated, somewhat understated objectives of Quad, the Indo-Pacific and other groupings, to asserting that a one-sided view of rights and obligations cannot work, within quotes. This is to paraphrase a recent statement by Dr. Jaishankar, in the presence, mind you, of his Chinese and Pakistani counterparts just earlier this week. The Chinese response to all this also seems clear, and it is exemplified by the messages from the recent CCP bash celebrating its birth centenary, with President Xi warning of bloody heads, within quotes, for anyone standing in China's way. And this is just one of many other similar statements and indications. In these statements, there is no hint anymore of the need for humility and modesty to overcome growing global suspicions about Chinese intentions, which used to be there once in a way a few days ago in high-level statements from China. And then there's a question of understanding, analyzing, and if possible, anticipating Russia's role in determining the shape of things to come. We have to accept that China has undoubted advantages in terms of lead time, coherent purpose, capacity to influence key leaders in target countries, and indeed delivery of projects on the ground. The least that China seems to be expecting from the US, according to one apparently authoritative Beijing establishment view, is for the US to stop threatening China's internal security and legitimate, within quotes, territorial claims, and accept a new multipolar order with the US and China at the core, delicately put. The danger, perhaps, is that the US may find this to be not a bad idea if its latest efforts in uniting democracies against China run into serious problems and are not able to take off in the near future. Speaking of Quads, there is another more sinister one already on the horizon, inspired by China, consisting of itself, Russia, Iran, and Pakistan. Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia has written an excellent article on this just today or yesterday, I think, this counter initiative, which I hope we can discuss a little later today. And give us this day our daily quad. How on earth to explain the new US, Pakistan, Afghan, Uzbekistan quad for Afghanistan, officially christened by the US as such, which ignores India and seems to provide a backdoor for China's entry. What seems to be clear is that it is in India's interest that the Quad, Indo-Pacific, and other initiatives we are talking about succeed in sending the intended signals with the desired impact. Perhaps it would be helpful to have more frequent and broad-based discussion in India, encompassing government, opposition parties, business, civil society, on the emerging international consensus on China, and on issues like Taiwan, Tibet, and Hong Kong. It would appear that relations with China are not likely to improve in the foreseeable future. The standoff at the border may continue. There could even be clashes. So there might have to be sacrifices and adjustments that Indian government, as well as businesses, for example, should be prepared for, on the need for diversifying a whole range of supplies to other countries where possible, on creating interlocking business arrangements within the region, which will foster greater regional interdependence, on expanding the focus of activities of Quad and Indo-Pacific to trade, to investment, resilient supply chain, and greater regional investment, and also to focus on some key sectors instead of, when we talk of resilient supply chain, instead of concentrating on routine exchanges, we should, as Ambassador Nirupama Rao has suggested in her latest paper, in high-tech areas to digital transformation, digital inclusion, and connectivity, which will be central to development efforts, as she has said, in the post-pandemic era. Another area of concern is China, attempting with some success to isolate India in its own backyard, South Asia. India's continuing cold shouldering of SAARC and refusal to dialogue with Pakistan is clearly being exploited to the full by China. These are some stray thoughts, but I must not keep you now from our distinguished panel. I'm sure that many of these points and many more will be covered in the presentations and the roundtable discussion and the Q&A session. So without further ado, may I now invite Ambassador Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary, former Ambassador to China, and of course she wears many other hats. Ambassador Nirupama Rao, the floor is yours. Nirupama.
Thank you, Ambassador Rajan, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this very distinguished panel today under your chairmanship. I will start with the question as to where are India-China relations today. All of you know it's been a season of change in India-China relations, and there has been more than a seasonal turbulence. This time it is different. We had, of course, the Doklam crisis in 2017. We had seen the adversarial approach of the Chinese on the issue of UN sanctions against Masood Azhar, on our entry into the nuclear suppliers group, the misadventure of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, our prolonged unease about the forays that the Chinese have made into India's neighborhood in South Asia, not just Pakistan, but Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. No real panacea had been provided by the informal summits that our Prime Minister had with President Xi Jinping. And to top it all, the unresolved boundary question along a continental space involving a land border of close to 4,000 kilometers has been the perennial. Memories of the conflict of 1962, in fact, the 60th anniversary is just round the corner in 2022. So this has been a live volcano that has erupted from time to time. The crisis in Galwan was waiting to happen. A shared sense of acute nationalism coupled with the need to defend sovereignty as defined by each country provided for tinder waiting to be set alight. The various agreements and mechanisms concluded bilaterally since 1993 to maintain peace and tranquility and to build mutual confidence did not prove a sufficient guard against the tragic sequence of events last June, in June 2020. The question is, what could have gone wrong? Now, as India has tried to match China's buildup of infrastructure in the border areas along what we both call the line of actual control, or the LAC, transgressions have increased across this line, particularly since 2013, and standoffs have occurred in 2013 and 2014 in Ladakh, and then of course in 2020, and of course in Doklam, which I just mentioned. What could be the motives behind the Chinese actions is the question that is constantly asked. Well, this is very speculative, but a number of reasons have been articulated. I don't think none of them are completely substantive. First, of course, the changes made on Article 370 by the government of India, which some say conveyed a signal that this was the beginning of Indian revanchism and a heightened beginning and quotes, and a heightened threat to Chinese control of Tibet. The Chinese seem to have misread our decisions on Article 370 completely, seeing it as a signaling of a muscular India's determination to recover lost territory. The Chinese have taken advantage of global distraction during the pandemic. They want to keep India bogged down, whatever the cost. Some Chinese analysts refer to India as practicing strategic ambiguity and obscurity on China. They say that Beijing does not want any defeat on foreign, and it wants foreign policy victories. It fears domestic discontent. They believe strategic friendship with India is untenable. They will maintain struggle on the ground without triggering war. That there is profound suspicion on both sides of each other's strategic ambitions and intentions. Other analysts say that China wants dominance on the border. Again, they view the relationship through the lens of Tibet. The border peace and tranquility agreements that India and China concluded did not mention infrastructure. And there is a view that a wide range of national capabilities, especially on the Chinese side, are involved in the conflict. What it all amounts to is that the post-1988 Rajiv Gandhi visit to China framework of relations, which helped us to manage the border dispute, promote cooperation amid competition, and the flexible framework of relations just created did not sustain adequate levels of trust. And tensions, as I said, escalated after 2013. There also seems to be no consensus among China's strategic circles on the fundamental aspects of India-China relations. Now, how is this crisis different, or is it different from the experience of the last 30 years? What is clear is that the operating system of India-China relations built since 1988 has dissipated. It has become largely defunct. It appears to lack resilience and durability, and it did not withstand the shockwaves of Galwan. The LAC between the two countries is not defined. One Chinese diplomat termed the line as just a concept And there is no such thing, he said, as a mutually agreed, impassable borderline on the ground, in maps or in the mind. That certainly seems to be the principle that the Chinese seem to be operating by. And therefore, the outlook does not look promising, and the complete erosion of mutual trust is strewn all over the landscape of the relationship. Now, will things change? Is there scope for improvement? I think we must prepare ourselves for distortion, for discord, for disruption, and for disequilibrium, the 4 Ds, as Chinese power and influence seek to maintain a growth trajectory in our region, even greater than that of the United States, and the latter seeks to oppose this trajectory of China's through various stratagems. The authoritarianism of Xi Jinping is clearly entrenched. There is a closing of China and a narrowness of perspectives in dealing both with questions of internal stability and external relations. It is, as one writer called it, China's heart of darkness. And it also involves the exercising of Chinese nationalistic zeal abroad, which is more and more in evidence. You see it in the case of Taiwan, particularly on the question of so-called reunification with Taiwan. Are we seeing the growth of Chinese empire? Although to China's wolf warrior diplomats, who mainly gear their rhetoric to please a domestic audience, the term may be distasteful. No country in the world really believes China's tales of victimhood or talk of a century of humiliation. But China and the United States have a power reach that recalls the girth, the spread, and the power of empires. And we in India, with our experience of another empire, should know that well. The bipolarity between China and the United States is threatening to create a chaotic global future, which is really a struggle between 2 large empires for global dominance. Is American, and I quote, great power chauvinism encountering its Chinese doppelganger, as Chas Freeman said recently? Can the next 10 years see the gradual replacement of unbridled rivalry and tension between these two by more dynamic forms of cooperation coexisting with competition that keeps the peace and involves a greater opening of minds? We may sound Pollyanna-ish as far as that is concerned. Of course, countries in the region may favor a great power balance between the US and China, with more room for maneuver rather than getting smothered under the weight and tension of great power competition. Strategic autonomy is not a discredited concept. It has its uses. It's become a survival technique. As far as the future is concerned, I'm reminded of the novelist Michael Ondaatje's words. I quote, "I no longer guess a future and do not know how we end or where," unquote. It will not be business as usual with China for us from now on. The Galwan incident involved a severe setback to bilateral relations, but engagement cannot be replaced overnight by disengagement. Faced with Chinese hostility and inflexibility on territorial issues concerning the boundary dispute, and I honestly feel the boundary question is really a territorial question. And on top of that, you have China's adversarial policies affecting India, especially in Pakistan. But we have to weigh the fallout of disengagement with due deliberation, assessing the costs to us internally as well as externally. We have to be deft with policy alternatives we put in place so that our economic interests are not targeted, and the options have to be weighed carefully. But there has been and will be a slowing down of bilateral contacts, and you can see the degree of chill that has set in not only in the short term, but will continue in the medium term, and who knows how far forward. China is certainly a country that's increasingly taking a relentless hardline position on territorial issues and border claims. And you see that attitude manifesting itself in the maritime space of the East and South China Seas. China really cannot take exception to our legitimate road building activity on our side of the LAC, but their attitude has not been reasonable in this regard, and they are deploying their own obiter dicta. Two facts are certain. The Chinese are buoyed by their military and logistic and infrastructure resources and a hubristic and insecure approach to neighborhood relations. They're showing a very muscular and assertive attitude in reinforcing their claims along the LAC. And they've paid very short shrift to India's, in terms of sensitivity to India's dealings with India across several fields, leading to an erosion of mutual trust. My personal view is that the Chinese were more nuanced and seemingly more sophisticated in their dealings with the world in the eras of Zhou Enlai or Deng Xiaoping, because they were buying time to build the country, cement ties with foreign countries because China was ostracized and isolated, and because they were keeping the powder dry as they improved their position. The language, however, of Chinese diplomacy, essentially Chinese Communist Party diplomacy, despite the changes in the country and the huge economic leap they have made, remains the language of the long march, of the struggle against foreigners, imbued with a style that reeks of suspicion and secrecy and aims at restoring Chinese greatness. Their historical memory is that of the wrongs unleashed on them by inimical forces, of their so-called humiliation at foreign hands, and they resolved at the outset of the founding of the People's Republic that they would never allow themselves to be similarly subjected ever again. Now, the events in Galwan should be a wake-up call to many of our Asian friends and partners, enabling a high-resolution envisioning of Chinese assertiveness. This is also the opportunity for us to align our interests much more strongly and unequivocally with the United States as a principal strategic partner, and infuse more energy into our relations with Japan, Australia, and ASEAN. The time may have also come to reconsider our stand on joining the RCEP. If we are to disengage from economic involvement with China and build the capabilities and capacities we need in manufacturing and in supply chains closer home, we cannot be prisoners of the short term. It's time to boldly take a long view in this area, as also on our South Asia policy. Good neighborhood relations are crucial for national stability and well-being. How do we manage this relationship with China? The challenge of China has to be met in many ways. Aggressive rhetoric is not the prescribed way. We have to deploy our diplomatic assets in a deft manner that allows for maneuverability and nimbleness. Our partnership with the United States is no doubt a very valuable asset, and we need to ensure high visibility of this partnership and of the leadership level trust that exists between our two countries. Our naval and maritime cooperation with the US and with democracies like Japan and with Australia, and a more energized Act East policy should be in the line of vision of the Chinese, showing the strategic assets we can leverage in the Indian Ocean region. Relations with Indonesia, for instance, have not received the focus from India that they deserve. It's time we paid more attention to our relationship with the EU and leading members of the EU like France and Germany, two like-minded democracies who are committed to multilateralism, to equality and non-hegemonic behavior in the international sphere. On the geo-economic front, as I said, we have to carefully assess our trade and investment relations with China, the interests, what are Chinese companies operating in India doing, see how we can drive a much harder bargain, deploy greater pressure on this front that signals to Beijing that the relationship with India is no trifling matter. The tough gets going in many ways. The India-China relationship straddles a wide spectrum, a land border among the longest in the world, not mutually agreed upon, spells the signs of a protracted contest. The closed-door approach of the Chinese has cut off all ties between our Himalayan regions and Tibet. This is a line that I constantly talk of. Ties that were people-centered. It's compromised the historical geo-civilizational dimension of these relations. But in the last 30 years, both countries, India and China, have traveled a great distance, perhaps China more, I just recall in 1978, China's GDP was just $149 billion, just 1.75% of the global GDP. China's GDP that year was about the same as India's 140 billion. China's per capita GDP was $156, even less than India's $203. And fast forward 40 years to 2018, and China's economy is 12.2 trillion for that year, accounting for 15% of the global GDP and nearly 5 times that of India's. Its per capita income is $8,825, over 4 times India's $1,939. It's the world's second largest economy, and the forecast is that it will surpass the US by 2030. It's now the linchpin of the globalized world. So the asymmetry of power between us and China has increased exponentially. Now, do we tear up all that we did with China to maintain peace and tranquility on the borders? These agreements cannot operate. We've learned that lesson in the absence of mutual trust and growing combative coexistence between the two sides. We obviously need to go back to the drawing board. The lack of a mutually clarified LAC is a major obstacle, but the Chinese have been consistently obdurate on this issue. They refuse to work with us on this. But the need for peace and tranquility cannot be pushed aside, and we must devise a workable system to achieve this. We have the past of 7 decades of dealing with communist China, more than our partners in the Quad, the US, Japan, or Australia. I'm talking of post-World War II. I think we are best placed to understand the tenor, the tone, the meanings inherent, the mode of operation of Chinese diplomacy and approach to disputes than any other country in the region. Underlying all this must be the realization that until we, both countries, India and China, make a determined effort to resolve the boundary question, which I said is a territorial dispute, there will always be a tenuous and relatively fragile situation in bilateral relations. Ambassador, have I crossed my 10 minutes? You're mute, I'm afraid. I can't hear you.
No, you've been saying so many interesting things that I've not been looking at the watch.
I'll just give 2-3 minutes more and I'll finish.
Okay, sure.
So turning to our region, they say China has become the second sun in the South Asian sky. The region of South Asia is considered by China as, particularly the land border with India, is considered as a secondary strategic direction. The first strategic direction being East Asia and the Western and Central Pacific. But this region, our region, is very much a part of China's Go West policy. It's a transverse section for both the maritime Silk Road and the land belt of the Belt and Road Initiative, with the flagship BRI project of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, a trigger for Indian concern as it runs through Pakistan-occupied territory in Kashmir and in Ladakh. So in the words of the Chinese India specialist Hu Xiusheng, the strategic importance of South Asia and the northern Indian Ocean to China is no less than it is for India. The BRI is seen as Emperor Xi Jinping's new road. It was described recently as a shambolic initiative, more Maoist than Marshall Plan, but it's strategically central to Xi Jinping's personal brand, a project of national rejuvenation and imperial resurrection, building a semi-imagined imperial tributary system with Xi Jinping at its core. There is a military geography to the BRI, which buttresses its geostrategic risk, and it was the PLA's concerns about vulnerabilities on China's eastern flank in the 90s that spurred the idea of westward expansion. That is a foundational precept of the BRI. Now, we are at the crossroads in South Asia today, particularly India. I believe we have not considered South Asia as an integer, but as an arena, not a region. The tensions between India and Pakistan, India and China, have inscribed a deepened dissonance in the region. Of course, the BRI and the CPEC have created additional complications. but the need for our neighborhood to define a consonant and shared mutually beneficial vision among the 8 nations that make up South Asia, how we can achieve a South Asia 2050 paradigm that is steeped in greater integration, connectivity across many sectors, including between people, stressing open democratic values, respect for diversity, good governance. We have to work, I think India particularly, at restoring the idea of South Asia as an integer. Meanwhile, our neighbors, our smaller neighbors in South Asia, they use various techniques against us. They either hedge, or they're balancing, or they're bandwagoning with China. And they are riding a geopolitical seesaw. It's very clear. But there are areas of cooperation in SAARC, as in case many of us may have forgotten SAARC, areas like atmospheric pollution, fertilizer use in agriculture, cross-border vectors of disease, regional commerce, economic rationalization, social inclusion, the Human Development Index. And we are connected to our neighbors. I mean, you look at Nepal and our open border with Nepal, the very seamless way in which our two peoples are, very well integrated. So South Asia, from our point of view, cannot be seen as some kind of a centralized Jambu Dvipa, a mega state with India at its core. Ideal South Asian regionalism is about devolution, it's about federalism, it's about strengthening local democracy. And the sabotaging of SAARC that we've seen over the years, thanks mainly to Pakistan's attitude, can hardly be considered a victory. It is a feather-light geopolitical stratagem that fails to consider that regionalism can bring potent growth to India's own peripheral regions. So at this moment, China is posing an alternative to India and South Asia, and India needs to work on two very complicated relationships, Pakistan and China. Will our government, will the bureaucrats who man the government be able to exhibit that long-term strategic vision? That is a matter of debate. I'll stop here because I think I've exceeded my time, and we can continue during the discussion. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Nirupama. You've said so many things of interest that I will not try and pick up elements which were of particular interest. But I will move on to Professor Raja Mohan. I'm sure we will discuss many of the things that you've said later. Raja, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Rajan. Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to see so many friends around this table on this very, very important subject. Ambassador Rao covered all the issues relating to India-China relations and has given us a comprehensive picture of the kind of challenges that we face. What I will do is really to focus on 3 sets of issues that would define any Indian strategy to China, towards China in the days ahead. But before we get there, I think it's important to see that the challenge that China presents us, is not a passing one. It is going to be multiple generations of Indians are going to have to deal with it. Ambassador Rao talked about the asymmetry between us today, and I think that's a very, very important factor. And whatever we do, even if you are phenomenally successful, that asymmetry is not going to decline in the near future. So coping with this power gap with China is going to be our principal problem for India's national strategy and not just foreign policy. Now, India has never faced a large power on its doorstep. In fact, under the British Raj, the British Raj was the power that was influencing its neighborhood. But today, we have another power far more superior to India's capabilities today, that is, whose influence is radiating all across India's frontiers, both northern and southern. And we must remember that China has dealt with 2 great powers on its frontiers. That's modern China. It had the Soviet Russia, which was the superpower at that point of time, and the United States, which was sitting on the first island chain facing China. So compared to the challenges they faced, ours probably is much less. But nevertheless, it is not a condition that India is used to. Therefore, this is going to present even multiple problems in the way we think about China. So the three sets of issues that I want to raise, one is the cognitive challenge. That India has been reluctant to recognize that we face threat from China until fairly recently. While the power imbalance has come quite clear today, that you had a powerful unified China on our northern borders. I mean, if you want to go back to the debate between Nehru and Patel or Mr. Bajpayee, who Girija Shankar Bajpayee wrote the letter, that the reluctance to see China as a problem and the hope that somehow that problem will go away was, I think, I'm not saying this to criticize anyone, but I think as we look back at our history, it's important to remember that there was a hesitation in Delhi to recognize China was going to be a huge problem. And in fact, the way we defined our hierarchy of threats in the 1940s and 50s, we framed the West and its influence in our region as a bigger problem than a China that had begun to occupy our frontiers. Now, I'm not questioning the judgment, but the fact is that had consequences. And I think those consequences have been rather severe. And today, changing that, how we think about the hierarchy of threats from a power perspective, not in sentimental or ideological perspectives of fellow Asians, Asian solidarity, developing world, North versus the South, East versus the West, that the need to see this in a purely power terms and the need to define which is the primary threat. And I think no way we can today ignore the fact that Chinese power poses the principal threat to India's security, and dealing with that is going to be our problem. Related to this, the sense that we've had, despite the growing asymmetry in the last many decades, last 3 decades certainly, that we've continued to see ourselves as some kind of an equal to China. In potential, yes, but at this point of time and in the near term, China's capabilities are going to be far more superior. So I think we should discard the myth of parity and recognize the imbalance of power. And addressing that imbalance in power will be the principal objective of our national strategy. And that should be the basis for dealing with China and seeing it in power terms and seeing that we are a weaker power, and addressing the power gap must be our principal challenge. And this might require asymmetric strategies. This might require the way we think about China. It's not going to be measure for measure. We're not going to be able to match them. So therefore, thinking asymmetrically, thinking as a weaker power, that is accepting the reality, is the first step towards doing any significant transformation of how we think about China. The second element, I think, of our strategy must necessarily be that if the power gap between China and us is going to be an enduring one, at least for the coming 2 decades or more. Addressing the power gap, one element of that must be building coalitions. That for us, I mean, that if alliances and coalitions are so central to statecraft, whether you read Panchatantra, whether you read Kautilya, whether you read Sun Tzu, that alliances are the way countries accrete to their power in dealing with a bigger neighbor or bigger challenge that they face. But yet, in India, we've spent enormous energies on why we should not have alliances or why we cannot have coalitions. And I think that approach, I mean, I think they kind of, I'm sorry to say this, but the kind of metaphysical debate on non-alignment, rather than seeing the world in power terms, as if preserving non-alignment is our first principle, and not preserving and fighting the imbalance in power. I think that I think hopefully we've passed that phase today. And that today we are seeing that India is defining China as a principal problem. It's no longer defining the West as our principal problem. And that it is recognized that we need to work with the Western partners to deal with the Chinese challenge. I think that's a big shift in our thinking. I think the Quad is just the beginning. And how we get there, I mean, I think this is not something, the issues that it's going to raise are not going to be solved. But one thing is certain, The constancy of power gap between China and us will be there. And that we need partners, you want to call them allies, coalition partners, whatever you call them, that we need partners to bridge the gap with China, unless, of course, we want to simply accept the Chinese dominance and accept the terms for a reconciliation. That's always there. But I think, I suppose, presume we're not going to do that. So therefore, within this framework of building coalitions, I mean, I think one of the questions in the concept note that Ambassador Rajan asked, do we need to agree with the Americans on everything? I mean, one of you referred to in the concept note, we disagree on Myanmar. So what? This idea that alliances mean complete unanimity or coalition means complete unanimity is again a mythology we imported from Cold War, even with the Russians. We had huge number of differences, for example, on the NPT and a whole range of other issues. But so therefore, this idea that somehow the Americans must agree with us on everything for us to be their partner, I think is a mistake. And we should not let the narcissism of small differences to derail us. Look at NATO. Germany has had huge problems with the Americans on the question of the Nord Stream 2. That did not break the alliance. And the Americans are making a compromise to let Germany deal with Russia for its own benefit. In fact, in the coalition building, many countries have many differences with the US. So therefore, this idea somehow we have to agree on everything or we are not partners. I think that's not the way the world works. And I see that today we are going beyond that phase into engaging with the US and the Quad in forms wherever we can. And I think that's a positive step forward. If you look at the future, and I think it is the principal objective of building a Quad is to how do we leverage our friends to strengthen our national capability? That should be the sole purpose, a national capability that will prepare us better to deal with the Chinese challenge. And that's exactly what China has done in its engagement with the US, initially in dealing with the Soviet Union, and later in making itself a powerful force through a collaboration and partnership with the West, but never giving up its own sense of national purpose and interest. Within the region, I mean, I think Nirupama has talked a lot about it. I think we began with a handicap in 1947. If we saw India got divided, and in 1949, China got united. But China doesn't have to do too much to play our neighbors against us because the partition and the scar it has left creates natural ways in which China can balance India without trying too hard. So for us, I think any strategy of matching China over the longer term, of securing our own position in the neighborhood, must necessarily be, do we transcend partition? How do we transcend partition? To a large extent, I think we've succeeded with Bangladesh in resolving the boundary dispute and resolving the maritime disputes, in opening this 4,000-kilometer border that got closed. And that is a huge, immense achievement. And I don't see a prospect for doing something similar with Pakistan in the near term. But I think doing that must necessarily be, we keep trying. Today, the gap between, just as the gap between India and China has increased, so has the gap between India and Pakistan. Today, India's economy is 10 times bigger than Pakistan's, and that gives us a lot more room to engage China. Pakistan, of course, has a whole lot of facilities for itself. The real challenge, I think, this is my last point, for India's the strategy in dealing with China is not on the foreign policy side. And you could argue in the last few years or the last decade and more, we've taken a number of steps on foreign policy of expanding relationship with the US, US allies in Asia, neighborhood policies, expanding connectivity. We've done a lot of things within the region, within the international system. But our problems, the genius of foreign policy, framing a set of solutions for India's problems with China, cannot be carried through if there is no matching domestic effort. That is, most of India's failings today or problems are really not at the foreign policy or diplomatic level, but internal level. And I would just point to 2 or 3, and I would leave it there. One, the question of reform. The source of Chinese success in the last 3 decades has been relentless internal reform of itself. Of course, they had great misfortune or fortune that Mao had wrecked the system and that you could build on a clean slate. But the fact is, they've constantly reformed themselves. So the simple slogan of 4 modernizations was taken seriously, was pursued, and therefore you have a transformed China. And for us, I mean, we can give, I mean, I'm not talking about, we have any number of circumstances that why we can't do it. But the longer we take to reform, and not just the economy, but our whole social structure, the way we do business with ourselves, then I think the costs of delayed reform would be huge on India's ability to deal with China. Second, it is not clear if our commitment to modernization or more fundamentally modernity is a given. The recent debates, whether it is Ayurveda versus allopathy, when it came to the vaccines, the drag of the past. I mean, a natural solution like the Chinese solution would be invest modern technology resources to understand Ayurveda better and do what works for you, rather than framing the past knowledge of India as better than the present challenges that confront. I think this is an issue that we are falling back on our commitment to modernization as a society is a serious one. And that when Chinese are doing, investing in synthetic biology, here we are debating the virtues of cow protection. I don't want to go into the merits of the issue, but there is a problem in terms of what are the national grand priorities are we ready to rejuvenate our commitment to modernization in a very fundamental manner. And then the question of internal cohesion. India's historic problem has been its internal divisions. You could argue that diversity is natural and diversity is not a disability. But the fact is, if you let India's internal diversity lead to greater internal differences and divisions, our ability to cope with a China that is deeply united, hopefully some bonus will come at some point, but you can't bet on that. But at this point, that our internal coherence is as important as our commitment to modernization. So therefore, without this solid national effort, our ability to deal with China is going to be that much harder. And a lot of cases, China is not the problem. Nobody has stopped us from building infrastructure on our border with Nepal. That Sri Lanka has a bigger trade with China means that somewhere we have slackened, that our trade facilitation, our trade policies, our regional economic policies have much to be done. So those can't be done by the Foreign Office. However much Foreign Office can define the objectives, those must necessarily be done by our economic bureaucracy and the larger elements of national strategy. So I would say strengthening that part of the strategy and building a new consensus on those would be critical, because Chinese challenge is not going to go away, and the problem of dealing with it is going to get ever harder if we don't reform ourselves internally and strengthen ourselves as a society and as an economy and as a polity. Thank you. Ms. Rajan, I'm done.
I think the asymmetry in hard power is something that one will have to accept for the foreseeable future. But the surprising thing is that even in regard to soft power, there seems to be a bit of problem in our using our soft power effectively. But anyway, we will come to that later. But thank you for reminding us of the importance of strengthening coalition building at this particular juncture in our history. And also that we need not fight shy of differences within the coalition. Well, that's a very important point that you made. I'd like to now invite our panelists at the round table to make their comments, starting with Dr. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Professor, Dean of the Office of International Affairs and Global Initiatives, Chairman of RIS, former Ambassador to France and GATT, etc., etc. Ambassador Mohan Kumar.
Sir, thank you very much. I want to pay my respects to my seniors, of whom there is not one, Ambassador Nirupama Rao. Of course, I've worked under her in Colombo, but there are others as well. Ambassador Neelam Sabharwal, Ambassador Bhatia, and all my other distinguished colleagues. I thought that was a quite a masterly tour de horizon by Ambassador Nirupama Rao, and a wonderful construction of a strategic framework by Professor Raja Mohan as only he can. So I'm not going to get into the substantive aspects because they have covered it in such great detail, and there are other panelists who are waiting to speak. I will play to my strength, which is trade investment, and I will speak to that. But before that, just a couple of points. One, in addition to the reasons Ambassador Nirupama Rao so eloquently put forward as to why China did what they did, can I provoke my more knowledgeable China colleagues, because I'm not a China expert, and that's a full disclosure. Is it possible they miscalculated? Is China immune from monumental errors? I ask that question because increasingly my feeling is, frankly, even if a country is as powerful as China, you don't go around having so many problems on your border as you have now, whether it is with India, China, United States, Japan, etc. So I asked that question. I'm going to take off actually from one of the points that Professor Raja Mohan left, which is alliance building. On the Quad, it is my assessment, and I put forward this provocative proposition, if you like. If I look at the Quad, actually United States, Australia are definitely doing what is known as hard balancing vis-a-vis China. I see Japan's position has changed. If you see their recent national defense paper, they mention Taiwan, and it seems to me that Japanese national interest now includes what is happening in Taiwan. That is a big change in my view, which really leaves out only India. And it could be argued that we are doing soft balancing as opposed to United States and others who are doing hard balancing. So my view on what India is doing in the Quad is we need to do more of that. And I also think involving France in Indian Ocean is an excellent idea. I was ambassador there when we had the first maritime dialogue, but since then things have evolved. And France is a resident power in the Indian Ocean. And if we want to counter China there, I can think of no other power, frankly. So this is something we need to do with France. France would not like to be labeled as, anti-China or anything. They have their own concerns. So it's better to engage with them quietly. I will now look at ASEAN and ask some of my distinguished panelists whether it is not the Achilles heel of this whole framework that we are trying to build vis-a-vis China. I do not believe ASEAN has made up its mind. It will probably not make up its mind as much as it can afford to. It will only choose when push comes to shove. And even then it is not clear. It's also bitterly divided down the middle. We repeat the mantra of ASEAN centrality. I ask myself, if you want to concentrate on Quad, where is the ASEAN centrality? And we will have to look at this. At least India will have to take a good look at this. At least ask ASEAN, what are those red lines? What are the red lines they have vis-a-vis China? Because I'm not clear, I understand. On trade and investment, I want to start by making this proposition that while as a result of Ladakh, we are not able to inflict great damage on China, which is true on trade and investment, because we are a much smaller player. We can deprive them of substantial gain, which I believe we have done by making sure, I hope permanently, that Huawei and others will be out of 5G and our data will be protected. If you even half believe the slogan that data is the new oil, it is a very significant infliction of at least potential gain. We are depriving China of potential gain. This is being underestimated by scholars who don't understand that data is a big thing. So to say that India's trade is nothing, we have not done anything, and that China doesn't lose anything is completely wrong. I think we have inflicted this kind of damage. It's not damage in the present, but we are depriving them of very substantial gain. Data relating to 1.3 billion people in India is no mean matter. And the Chinese would have enjoyed it, frankly, and they would have taken over if it wasn't for what happened in Ladakh. That is my assessment. On trade, again, I see reports 2021, China is the biggest trade player. How can you then say that, you look at the statistics for God's sake. Basically, we have bought oxygen concentrators, monitors, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and bulk drugs. This is what you have increased during this period. And what have we exported to them? We have exported to them iron ore, steel, aluminum, and copper. So I want to make my second proposition on trade and investment, the one on data. The second, there is a strategic trade and there is non-strategic trade. So it goes back to this slogan about potato chips versus computer chips. If you have to buy potato chips from China, go ahead and do it. I really don't care. The important thing is, where are you going to get your computer chips from or semiconductors from? And I think there we have made it clear to them, when it comes to investment, we will strategically screen investment and not allow any investment which has the slightest negative connotation on national security. So I am happy with the strategic screening process. If they have to invest, and like one minister said, if you have to import buttons and zippers from China, go ahead, because anyway, you're going to import it from some source, and that will continue for a while. But I think if we can somehow strengthen the strategic investment process, this is already in place, so that we do not allow Chinese investment in sectors which we consider strategic, I still think this will be depriving them of substantial gain. Again, I don't speak of inflicting damage on a big player like China. I'm talking about how gain can be deprived. I also believe that when it comes to investment from China, it is again hugely exaggerated. 90% of their investment is brownfield investment. It is not greenfield investment in India. So frankly, think that if you look at the period between 2000 to 2020, there was just $2.43 billion which were invested by China in India, which is 0.5% of the total investment that comes. So again, I do not believe, it is true that in the unicorns, their investment was disproportionate, but there I think it is just as well that we try to get our act together. We should be able to have unicorns with Indian investment rather than Chinese investment. I wanted to talk about the resilience supply chain initiative launched by India, Australia, and Japan in April 2021. It's early days, but I see some potential there if we can somehow work closely with these countries like Australia and Japan, and also include United States and others. Then I think we will be able to do two things. One, support enhanced use of digital technology, and second, you have trade and investment diversification. So I'm going to conclude by talking about a study on pharmaceutical products. My time is up, so I'll just take half a minute. Pharmaceutical products, RIS did a study of which I'm the chairman, and we found actually that the production-linked incentive scheme launched by the government of India will go a long distance in trying to get back the production of active pharmaceutical ingredients. We depend heavily on bulk drugs from China, but there is no rocket science involved. IDPL, which was incidentally my first job, Indian Drugs and Pharmaceuticals Limited, used to make all these bulk drugs. So we can easily do those without having to rely on China. And the production-linked incentive scheme, I think, will go a long way. I'll stop here, sir, and maybe participate in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mohan. You've covered all the points in the limited time that you had, which I wanted you to. I would have liked you to have spoken a little about the importance of concluding FTAs with the UK and the EU to offset the disadvantages of not being in RCEP, but maybe we can come to that a little later. I now request Professor Alka Acharya to please come in. Professor Alka Acharya, Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, JNU, former chairperson, Institute of Chinese Studies. Alka ji.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pastor Rajan, for inviting me to this platform. It's great to see old friends, and particularly Ambassador Rao. Long time since one has actually, well, one has been hearing her a lot on all these various Zoom platforms. So yes, it has been again a treat as usual. she brings so much of poetry and philosophy into her writing. It's really lovely to listen to that. So as I see it, pretty much a lot of ground has been covered. And in keeping with the theme that you identified, Ambassador Rajan, about managing relations with China, I'm just going to make maybe 3 or 4 broad points, which are stemming in many ways from the presentations that have been made. And this is essentially about understanding, because before we start this business of managing, the point that comes up is what is our understanding of China? Now, clearly what we are dealing with now is very different from what we were dealing with in 1949, what we were dealing with in the 70s, what we were dealing with when the Rajiv Gandhi moment came to pass, as it were, and we moved into a different paradigm. Now, when I say understanding, I'm trying to react to one point which Ambassador Rao had also made about that India is best placed to understand, be able to deal with China because we've got so much of experience of dealing with China. And I wonder whether that experience has actually transformed, translated, come into the way in which we have evolved our policies towards China. There is Rajamohan's point made earlier that there was a reluctance on India's part to take China as a challenge or as a strategic threat. Now, I'm really putting the question on its head in a sense that there were sufficient debates in India about China, even at the time of independence, Patel's letter and so on. But there was a certain choice that was made in terms of engaging, dealing, sorting out the problem with a country which was your neighbor and with which you obviously had to start building up a kind of an equation. So the choices were made at various stages, and the choices were always in favor of promoting the engagement, enlarging the engagement. And clearly, therefore, there have been certain kind of decisions taken along the way. Today, we have a very different kind of a situation when the rising power that is now confronting us. The question is, what kind of a power is this? And I believe that when we start to address this question of the power of China, it's not simply to just talk in terms of the asymmetries, which are of course there. It's not enough to talk in terms of capabilities, but I think the nature of China's power needs to be understood. And for too long, we have got into these binaries of authoritarian versus democratic, Communist Party versus liberal democracies. And I think somewhere when we are starting to deal with this rising power, the question we need to ask ourselves, is China as a country led by a Communist Party going to be a different power compared to the earlier superpowers? And that's where I think we need to make some very, very strongly realist assessments of the nature of this power, because we are not talking merely now of a power with which we were trying to engage in a different kind of a way, but with a power that, which we seem to have come to at some kind of a cross. The discourse in India is all about how it is not possible to deal with China as of yore. It's not going to be business as usual. Then what is it going to be? Because the reality is this asymmetry. And then the question of managing. So I think somewhere, to cut the clutter really, and I'm sort of going a bit, I think we need to be very clear about the fact that this is going to be a power which has the capacity to create trouble in your neighborhood, which has the capacity to outclass you in terms of whatever you may have to offer countries by way of assistance and aid. It has the power to completely outstrip your abilities to create your own, not just in your own region, but Now, when you read something like this, I think Rajamohan made a very, very substantial argument about the need to look at coalitions, not simply in terms of complete unanimity and harmony, but in terms of broad objectives. That's fine. But I think this question of dealing with this country has to begin with how you strengthen your own capabilities. Whether in that kind of a context, I mean, the argument is often made about how China also kept its head down, focused on building. You want to deal with China, which is 10, 15, 20 yourself strong. Now, my question therefore starts from that if you need to make yourself strong, if you've got to think in terms of the next 2 decades over which you will gradually catch up, fine, you can think in terms of depriving them of this gain or that gain. But fundamentally, this concept of build, you try and get the requirements from where you can. Who is now in a position to give us those kind of inputs? Where are we going to get the necessary wherewithal? Because we need a lot. So at this point, there are these 2 elements come together. Your ability to build yourself up internally. Of course, there are those other challenges which Raj mentioned about how exactly are we tackling this task of modernization, modernity, the kind of discourse that we should be having. But there's also this question of strengthening. I do recall there was once, I forget, I think it was Kishore Nehwani who said that India needs to be smart about China. Can you leverage China? The question here is that if we are talking in terms of as well, lots of people are talking about the need to find a new equilibrium with China, and I'm somewhat confused by that idea. What does this mean actually, to find a new equilibrium? The fact is that the Chinese are now sitting on our territory. And there also, of course, because nothing is in the public domain. So here there are 3 different kinds of challenges. Do we continue on this route of management, which is somehow keep things going, keep hoping that there'll be some breakthrough, which is a coalition route. Build your alliances, try and see where you can get the Chinese to think. But here again, and both the speakers earlier have pointed out, we cannot expect the other people to fire. Be completely sanguine that these coalition partners are going to be willing to actually stand with you to fight the Chinese. It's not like that. It's not black and white anymore. So managing, but very differently. This coalition is not going to be and mind you, it's not just about having identical views. We are broadly agreed upon the threat that comes from China. But the question is, are these coalition partners ready to do the kind of things that would be required? As Ramohan Kumar just mentioned, the French don't want to be seen as anti-China. Nobody wants to be seen as anti-China. And it's not just that ASEAN is this big undecided kind of area. I think sides anymore. So I don't know how these coalitions are going to work. And I think finally this question of realism, and therefore come back to the question of understanding. When I say that we need to understand this power, we need to be more realistic about it. Unfortunately, our realism tends to go in the direction, it's only talking in terms of our capability and zero-sum equations. So let me in conclusion say that we have a very formidable challenge, and to my mind, there is no getting away from the fact that you can routes to be with China. Strengthening yourself, there again, I think that we can think of China's role here. Making yourself capable to also be useful to your own partners. uh, as the kind of power in your own neighborhood first. What I'm talking about is a fairly long-term period where we have to stop thinking in terms of playing this world leader or being some kind of a Vishnu Guru or being some kind of taking the lead in various kinds of things. I mean, really focus on the internal building. That, it's often said that the Chinese respect strength. They're not going to respect the strength that you get from coalition partners. So if you want
Sorry,
to
Alka,
get the Chinese to respect you, I
think your
Thank
voice is getting shorter, but thank you, Alkaji. You made some very, very important point. Thank you so much. I will now race ahead and request Mr. Harsh Pant, Director Strategic Studies Program, ORF, and Professor International Relations, King's College London. Harshi, please come in.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for making me part of this very interesting conversation. I think most of the points have been covered by several speakers before me. I would just make a couple of points which are more about, I think, the cognitive challenge that Raja sort of talked about earlier. I'm again following in Dr. Mohan Kumar's, Ambassador Kumar's footsteps. I would also say that I'm not really a China specialist. I have always been a student of international relations and Indian foreign policy. So my approach to this question of China from a very long-standing point of view has always been about looking at it from a perspective of what the rise of China is doing to Indian interests. And I have always been confounded by this debate in India, where it was always this question that if you talk about positioning India more substantively vis-a-vis China, you were talked of as a hardliner. You go back just a decade back, this discussion would have been, oh, you are a hardliner. You don't know anything about China. You don't know how China functions. It's a different kind of power. It's a very nuanced country. We have to have nuance in our approach to China. And so for me, it was coming from a different vantage point. As a scholar of international relations, there are only two ways of looking at a rising power and how it behaves. You either have history, you go into historical domain and figure out what historically rising powers have done to their neighbors, or you have very limited assessment of theoretical point of view. That how theories tell you, whatever little theories you have. I know I'm in August company of very senior academics and masters. But for an academic, primarily you only talk of theories or history. That's the only way to assess what rising powers do. That's the only way to assess what China would be doing. And for a long time, the argument was that, look, China is a different kind of power. But today, suddenly in India, everyone is a hardliner. We are all talking the same language. We are all saying, no, this is how we should be behaving. It can't be business as usual. We should be taking a harder line. So I think the first challenge for me as a scholar is to understand what actually went wrong. Where did we get wrong? Where did we go wrong? And if we went wrong, because unless we understand where we go, how we ended up in this place, I don't think we can frame a policy going ahead. So I think clearly the questions are, and which are some fundamental questions to be asked. What was happening in the decades when we were actually, as Ambassador Rao put it, we were not doing that badly vis-a-vis China. We almost had, we had, at least in the policy-making community, in the decision-making community, there was some understanding of what China was doing. And yet the outcome was suboptimal. We could not build adequate infrastructure. We could not develop capacities, and we could not, I think, as Raja put it, use flexibility in our approach to international equilibrium. So the question, therefore, is, for me as a student of Indian foreign policy, how do we understand this trend, and where did we go wrong, so that we can assess how we can move forward. Now, if post 1998 framework that is clearly not working, and now we are all in agreement that it has not worked. China used it gradually to alter the status quo to its advantage. But why was it that for India it seemed an end in itself? That would deliver us the goods. Why did it happen? And so that that consensus that was there in India, that needs to be understood. That how did we end up in that consensus? I frankly have no understanding at this moment, because we have very rapidly moved to a position where we are all speaking the same language. We are all hardliners. We are all talking of not having business as usual. So I think clearly something is a challenge. Now, when I look at China today, and there are much senior scholars of China here in the panel, but if I look at China today, there are two things. One is a structural reality, which is China is rising. Therefore, it is shaping the region in its own, in its own image. And so it will do something to its neighbors. It will do something to other powers. It will try to prevent other powers from rising. That's a standard realist, theory, and one can assess and make a point about what China is doing. But also what is important is what we are now repeatedly saying. Look, Xi Jinping is a very different beast, right? So Xi Jinping's power and centralization of power, and the way Xi Jinping has used various instruments of power within China, has really shifted the goalpost. So now, as maybe things were evolving, now there is almost a revolutionary spate to Chinese decision making. So I think clearly, if even domestic politically, we are getting a message that is in sync with the larger structural reality, that it is not simply China's rise structurally, but also domestic environment in China is positioning China in a certain way that will perhaps prevent China from articulating a certain worldview, and that will put pressure on its neighbors, including India. And this, therefore, leads to some very uncomfortable questions, which is, I think the question is, can India do anything to satisfy China? Are we in a position to do anything on that count? So if we are not, then is it primarily a structural position, a structural difference that has to be somehow, one step at a time? Then, this debate, which was again alluded to, and which I, as a scholar, find it fascinating, but I'm sure as practitioners, many of you in the panel find it very problematic, where we tie ourselves in knots about non-alignment, strategic autonomy. What does it mean? What comes first? How to go about it? I mean, these kind of debates which seemingly become an end in itself, without actually telling us, all right, what is it? What is this for? So I think that is, as an academic, it's fascinating, but as a practitioner, I'm sure there are huge issues here which create all kinds of issues, both in terms of how India positions itself discursively, as well as the implications it has on certain policy positions that India takes. And then I think the issue of that this is, and again, I think this has been pointed out, that this is at the end of the day a whole of government approach. This is not an approach that foreign policy itself can deal with. So at the end of the day, we are looking at all the ministries of the government coming together, and we are seeing some of that happening in a certain direction, but maybe that the kind of energies that are required are still not there, because if you do not have all the segments of the government coming together and framing an overarching policy that this is the end goal and this is how we are going to define it, which primarily will be about domestic capacities. Both Professor Acharya talked about it, others have talked about it, that at the end of the day, it is not about China, it is also about ourselves, what we can do about India, what we can do about building capacities in India, and what we can do about shaping the larger context in which India operates. It involves both building domestic capacities and building and taking help from our alliances and partnerships that we are now perhaps in a stage where we can take advantage of. So I think for me, those questions emerge primarily from the broader question of where did we go wrong? And if we did go wrong, and I'm not so sure everyone would agree, but if we did go wrong, then what are the lessons to be learned going forward? That because unless we have that debate, an honest debate about, or honest discussion about the fact that something really did go wrong in our assessment of China, I don't think the next stage we will have that clarity, which will be perhaps needed in not only taking on China, but also in acknowledging our partners and friends and adversaries alike. So I think those are the questions that emerge from this, from a larger point of view of what it means to look at China from a perspective which is both from outside in and inside out, whether I'm looking at it as a China expert or whether I'm looking at it as a student of Indian foreign policy, and therefore assessing what the rise of China means. Because honestly, even 2 decades back, many people, including myself, were writing that China is going to be a huge issue. It is a huge issue already. But there were people, very responsible people, who told us that you are in a minority. So clearly, what happened? And I want to understand that as an outsider. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've talked about what we can do to satisfy China and other thing, but you've not talked about things like Taiwan and Tibet, about which I think you've written recently. But maybe we can come to that later if time permits. Now I'd like to invite Mr. J. Ranade, former Additional Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat, President, Center for China Analysis and Strategy, to say his piece. Ranade sir.
Thank you, sir. I'm conscious that, we are running out of time. So I will make a few points that I think will hopefully make some contribution. I will also pick up on a couple of points that Raja made and which Harsh made about whether we spotted the indications in time or not, the warning indications from China. And let me paraphrase what they said and put it in my words, whether we fooled ourselves into believing that the band-aids that we had applied in our policy had worked or not. Let me mention a few points as I discuss that. First, it is a fact, of course, that China has been rising. It's been rising steadily. And as its comprehensive national power increased, it has started becoming more assertive in its neighborhood and also in international fora. As far as China is concerned, it had the United States in its crosshairs. That was its target. Their intention or ambition was to rival, if not surpass, the United States of America. Keeping that in mind, it was obvious that the accretion in their power was built to surpass that of any of their neighbors, including us. The impact of China's rise was direct for us. Whatever they did, we felt the brunt of that impact. With the result that today, I would not just look at a territorial threat from China. There are multiple threats that we face. And as Raja so eloquently put it, which will be passed on for at least 1 to 2 generations. Hopefully not that long, but at least it's certainly going to be a long-term threat. I think China's ambitions and designs to achieve those ambitions, or modalities to achieve those ambitions, got accelerated. They were not new, but they got accelerated with Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012. And let me just point to 2 particular things that he did. There was, as we are all aware, the Conference on Peripheral Diplomacy in 2013. And what he did was picked up the points from there, which said, confront outstanding issues head on. Don't set them aside in order to just have good relations with your neighbors. If necessary, build up alliances and even security alliances, things which China had never done. So they were obviously adopting a more muscular policy, and which was soon evident. The second thing was that in addition to looking at the South China Sea and its dominance over the South China Sea as a stepping stone to becoming a global power, China also saw South Asia as a territory or as an area that it needs to dominate. And it's set about doing that. And we are seeing that it already had a very strong relationship with Pakistan. And then when Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, the first leg of the Belt and Road Initiative to be operationalized was the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. That actually represented a fusion of military strength of the Chinese and Pakistani, and also the extension of China's diplomatic and economic power well beyond its borders into Pakistan, and their plans are even beyond. Let us see whether it works as far as Afghanistan is concerned. The second point is, it goes back slightly. Did we really miscalculate, or was there a degree of wishful thinking in how we could manage China? There was, as I think Alka brought out, there were debate in India. Well, not much of a debate. There was discussion, mild discussion on what our policy should be with China. That was in the late 40s when Prime Minister Nehru was there. He took a decision, he took a view that we need to build up the relationship with China. This was also in his book, Glimpses of World History. But here, interestingly enough, as far as Mao was concerned, and as far as Zhou Enlai was concerned, separately, they were very clear that there are limits to the relationship in which India and China could have. And Mao certainly looked at China as the only power in Asia. He was willing to give India a sort of secondary position, but a subsidiary position. The interesting thing here is the paper last year by Hu Shishang of the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, which is a think tank of the Ministry of State Security, the foreign intelligence arm of the Chinese. And he put it very candidly, very frankly, some would even say bluntly. He said that India-China relations were doomed for a clash from the time the two countries became independent. So he obviously was alluding to what Mao was thinking and what Zhou Enlai was thinking. And that is what he said. There is certainly an issue of territory, which the Chinese keep saying that we must recover all the territories that we lost due to the imposition of unequal treaties. And as far as they're concerned, they had a map published in 1954, which is being taught in their schools even today, which shows Ladakh, chunks of J&K, Arunachal Pradesh, pockets in Himachal, etc., as part of China, including, of course, other areas. So we do need to be cognizant about that. And going back to the point about Xi Jinping, since he came in, the number of intrusions increased, and we saw two major ones. One was in April 2013, when just days before Chinese Premier Li Keqiang was to come here on his first visit as Premier. That was a very unusual intrusion, lasted a long time. And according to at least what I was told by, let's say, someone who was interacting very closely with the Chinese military attaché here, he said that they had cleared the intrusion with the highest levels in their party, and who deliberated on it, and who said that the Indians will not call off Li Keqiang's visit because they would be afraid to do so. That was the thinking. I'm just giving that for that flavor. So that is the kind of thing that went on. After that, we noticed, at least I noticed, a few articles appearing claiming Ladakh as a part of China. One was in May 2013, soon after Li Keqiang's visit, which was published in the Chungpo Qingyan Pao, which is the China Youth Daily. Incidentally, it has a higher circulation than the People's Daily, which is the official paper of the party. And that, in very clear terms, traced the history, traced the commonality in customs, tradition, etc., and laid claim to Ladakh as being part of Chinese territory. This was repeated by Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, in fact, on the day he commented on the Galwan clash, 15th of June, and subsequently again, and even now, as recently as at Dushanbe, his statement was very categorical that the blame for the present situation lies on India, and that everyone knows what is right and wrong, and India has to sort it out. And he made it clear that there is going to be no pulling back till to the April 2020 positions. What I hear separately, well, let me just mention one more thing. When we talk about what we have to look to, Hu Shishang makes it very clear that contention on the border will continue. There will be a push, at times even armed clashes, till both armies settle on some kind of an informal red line, which they will not cross. So we are looking forward to a longish period, according to what he says, and I would tend to subscribe to that. The third thing which I would like to share with all of you is what, shall I say, people one has interacted with, they have told me, or they have said, is that they are, there is a desire, there is a feeling that India is rising very rapidly, has started its rise particularly after 2014. They want to stop it. They look at India's attempts to get into the UNSC, NSG, etc. as part of this, and they want to stop it. And that is one of the reasons why there will be, that's what the term they use, action against us at some time or the other to teach us a lesson. So this is the kind of scenario that I at least look at. It's not very satisfying. So what do we do is the question. I think there are a couple of things that do come to my mind. One is, as Ambassador Mohan Kumar said, we are taking steps, of course, on the economic front. I feel personally more needs to be done. India is a huge market, and I don't sense the United States and Europe opening their markets to China the way they had earlier because of the huge anti-COVID sentiment. The Chinese are aware of that, which leaves us as the largest market with money to spare. And I think we need to block them out of this market. That is the first point. Second, I think our timidity, which borders almost on deference to the Chinese, on issues like denying market access, on issues like Tibet and the Dalai Lama, we need to shed that. They've done what they need to do, the Chinese. I think we can afford to take a muscular or direct stance, and that might get them to negotiate with us or talk to us a bit more about it. It will at the least give us some leverage that we need. The third, rightly said, is we do need to build up coalitions. We do need to build up partnerships on the Quad. But I personally am a bit hesitant on the Quad. The question being, when push comes to shove, will the US and will Australia really step up to the plate, or will we be left holding the can? That is the first question. And the second, I'm already seeing a bit of wavering. Maybe that is just misreporting, but wavering on Biden's part vis-a-vis China. The latest was Angela Merkel's conversation with him and the kind of comments that were made, followed by Kurt Campbell's remarks on cooperation and competition, where he was stressing cooperation too. So I think these are areas that we would need to look at. We certainly need to build up our own strength that cannot be overemphasized domestically across multiple factors. But we also need to look at how we can accelerate our controls, if I may use the term very, shall I say wrongly or loosely, on our border areas. Because there is a kind of a creep that the Chinese are now doing by planning for 628 border defense villages. Already one across Kibitu, another one inside Bhutan, on the edges, but they are coming up. We will have, and on the other hand, our population, border populations are thinning out because the youngsters are moving inwards to towns, to urban centers for jobs, and old people are there, they follow the youngsters. So we will have to look at out-of-the-box kind of equations, like encouraging and allowing foreign adventure companies or hotels to come to these areas and maybe have more relaxed terms for investment, etc., where we can generate employment and do things like that. Finally, I think a lot depends on how the US-China relationship works out. For us, it's going to take time. We are going to need at least 5 to 10 years before we can compete or not compete, before we can effectively counter China. In the meantime, we must build up our asymmetric capabilities in missiles and develop our Andamans and Lakshadweep to block the Chinese on the maritime domain and build up our cyber capability. That's something we really need to accelerate if we can, and I don't see any reason why we cannot, in fact, overtake them. And we must nudge the United States into taking a tougher stand against China to the extent we can, because they're the only ones who can hobble them or stall their rise. And that's all we need, a 10-year window for us to take it on ourselves. And finally, I don't think in India anyone has any illusion that any partner or alliance friend, if I may say, is going to stand shoulder to shoulder with us to fight the Chinese. We are only looking for assistance in terms of intelligence, military hardware, etc. So I'll just end there. I know that I've spoken, I think, a bit too much, but Thank you, Ambassador Rajan. It's
Thank you.
for allowing me to put across my
Thank
points.
you. Thank you, Rane Saab. That is very precise, very grim, and very thought-provoking. I'll now request Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, Distinguished Fellow Foreign Policy Program, Gateway House, former Director General ICWA, former Ambassador to Myanmar and many other countries. Rajiv, please come in.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rajan. It's a real treat to listen to our experts and peers, and the bonus is the opportunity also to share some thoughts. I shall be very precise and succinct because the ground floor upwards construction has already taken place. So I shall focus on your basic question, what are our options? And here I would like to make 6 points, and I'll do so briefly. Please rest assured on that. First, we should all be very clear and agree on the nature of the threat. China, as far as we can see, listening to all our China experts and others, is not exactly preparing for the Third World War, whereafter the world will come to an end. So we should stop panicking. We should recognize that it is only about a strategic contestation. It is only about China securing as much as it can without firing a shot or not too many shots. And therefore, it is about competition for power, for dominance, and we should prepare accordingly. My second point is that we must prioritize our adversaries. We cannot turn the whole world into our adversaries and begin to fight with everybody. As far as India is concerned, we cannot have 2-front, 3-front, or 4-front war. 4 fronts would be China 1, Pakistan 2, terrorism 3, and Indian Ocean 4. We can at best really have a 1 or 2-front war. Therefore, we must revise our Pakistan policy. I think it's very important for us to recognize that China is adversary number 1. We must bring the utmost resilience of our diplomacy to bring in and start opening dialogue with Pakistan, normalize the relationship, and see how we can drive a wedge between Pakistan and China. And by the same logic, we should also keep impressing on our American friends that they are doing they're showing a complete lack of wisdom by driving Russia into the arms of China. They also have to do their bit. My third point is that the China threat is definitely about maritime security, about land security, but it is also about economy and technology. On that, our think tank, Gateway House, is working on a premier international experts team, and we will be coming out with very specific recommendations. I'm afraid I can't share all of them with you, but thinking is very much on those lines. My next point is really a message to all of us, to my colleagues in the field of diplomacy and also academia. Let us start being a little more frank with the government. Let us recognize that in many ways our neighborhood policy is not working. Let us recognize that in many ways our Act East policy is not working. We just keep swearing blindly Act East policy. The fact is that after our decision to exit RCEP, it is not working. And therefore, unless and until we find a method to win some of the ASEAN member states, forget about ASEAN. Let's talk now about the member states. Unless we are able to win over them, we have a problem. Two last points. One is, I think Quad is the way to go. We all know we should keep talking about this. We should not talk about it that, Quad is coming and sending troops to India to fight China. No, nobody's arguing that. So why demolish an argument which has not been made? The point is, there is a requirement for diplomatic and political coordination of a strategy among the Quad countries, and we should go beyond Quad. We should think of Quad plus and Quad plus plus. We all know these concepts. We should work on this. If we are disillusioned with Quad, if we are skeptical about Quad, we are weakening our case. We are weakening our case without knowing it. We should not do that. And while at that, thank you very much for making a mention of my op-ed which appeared this morning. I think we should keep a watch on the parallel Quad which Chinese seem to be developing. And I'm not arguing that the day Mr. Modi is in Washington for the next Quad summit, Xi Jinping will call Putin and the two others for a parallel summit. But we diplomats or former diplomats must know what is going on below the radar, and we should be alert about this. My last point, economic strengthening of India is absolutely essential. I think that is one point on which everybody would agree. But I think we need also to bring down the political temperature in this country now. Today, when some of us watched Prime Minister speaking in the Lok Sabha, trying to introduce the new ministers, and he was not allowed to speak because the opposition created a big ruckus. We are creating a terrible impression of our democracy in the world. We are showing to the world that we are disunited, we are indisciplined, we project indecision. I think this all has to stop. Otherwise, as Professor Raja Mohan said very rightly, these become problems which fall beyond the domain of diplomacy. So let us be candid, let us be very clear-eyed, and let us try to be a little bit more frank among ourselves and to the government. Thank you.
I think that was brief and brilliant. Thank you so much. Neelam, please come in.
Good afternoon, Ambassador Rajan. And first of all, allow me also to thank you very much for inviting me to be one of the panelists. And actually, I think I've turned out to be luckier waiting till the end. I think I've had the benefit of so many different perspectives. And I must say, there must be some kind of a divine design that even though everybody's addressing the same subject and the same theme, there really has not been any kind of overlap or a duplication. But I know time is little, and I would like to address some of those very valuable observations and analytical comments, but as I go along, so that I can at least try and present my point of view. But I would certainly like to thank all the fellow panelists. I'll just try and weave in some of these questions in what we've seen. I had thought that maybe there'll be no need to even describe what happened in Ladakh last year, because it is something that just we take it to start with. But I suppose if one is going to now make a case for finding a new equilibrium, recognizing or being cognitive about what China challenges. I mean, it is today, if we are not able to recognize what the China challenges, I think, I don't know what it will take for us, really to come up with the kind of policy, which I think right now, fortunately, the government is on the right track. And as we discuss the various options, we'll see what best can be done. The Chinese military intervention in Ladakh, which probably we all know in any case, I think, a part of the general pattern, but had specific triggers and specific objectives. And in our case, of course, we know what the end game was. And we also know that the message was a deliberate message, a twofold message to their long putative rival in Asia. One, we can embarrass you at will on the boundary in the border question. Two, you better not get too close to the Americans. And with that, anyway, they were able to, because we were really caught unawares, I think, they were able to advance their territorial objectives. They were able to thwart, for the present, I think, our infrastructural advances. And the message, of course, that, here is India with all its continental and landline border security questions, that how limited would be the value and quality of India as an ally for the US in the region in the maritime domain, which is what is really China's biggest security perception. So that brings us really then to the China challenges, as we all agree. We've used different terms the kind of power differential, the power asymmetry. And it is this which has brought new rivalries, new uncertainties, and China itself. We are facing today in China, and which is where, as one of the panelists said, where is it, at what time did we go wrong? And I want to come to Professor Pant's point on this. Did we not see by 2008, 2012, 13, how powerful China had become? Because till then things were going all right. I think the post 1988 template, however much people may like to devalue it today, it delivered us many years of peace and stability, and it reduced the volatility in our border regions. It gave us a more even-handed treatment of Kashmir, even of Pakistan. Jiang Zemin in Pakistan made a public statement. So I think there was a time when we were at par, when China needed a quiet border. I think there were many things. We had many cards in our hand at that time. We had this border situation, then we had Tibet, we had our Indian market. I think that they were interested. And this, even with, despite the nuclear test, which upset them so much because we had called the reason for that as the China threat, we were able to recover very quickly because they wanted relations to be on track. So 95 to 2005, again, we saw a good period. China was what they knew. We were very much wedded to strategic autonomy. We were not going to go into any countervailing or containing kind of strategies by the US or anybody else. So they even, signed the most ideal, which the Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao would know better than me, I think, on the political principles and parameters, and to keep us away from the Americans, even a security partnership, which I would agree with Jayadev Ranade. We are timid. Here is our land and territory occupied by the Chinese, and we agreed to the security partnership. These have been the kind of contradictions, but nevertheless, that period gave us stability. It gave us leverage in the neighborhood. It gave us leverage vis-a-vis the big powers, and also in terms of economic development and so on. At any hand, where somehow we missed the kind of, the red light or the beeping warning that China had made a transition. I think America also made that mistake, that they made a transition from being a regional power to a global power with an appetite to be a global power. And we have never had that kind of an appetite, even leave out the capabilities. So at any hand today, this is the situation that we are faced with. And now we somehow feel that, everything was going well. What has gone wrong? That India doesn't count. Now it is reinforced, that mindset and that impression, which we always had, that, we were just a bit player, that China would just come to us when it suited their self-interest, which was a very, it applies to everybody. Secondly, a dominant thinking that India has only looked at in terms of the great power rivalries, and people are often friends and colleagues don't recall, it's been there right since the 50s. They were always so nervous about any advances that we made in our relations with the Americans. In fact, it was Eisenhower's visit which made Mao and Zhou so envious, and was one of the inputs which went into finally in 62, where many other considerations were there, because they felt it will be because of course, some operations we had run also at one time in Tibet and so on. At any hand, so it has been a very, very important consideration for them. So, okay, now what we are feeling is they only look upon us as a developing country. They're only looking upon us as a neighbor. They don't really, by 2005, they were looking at us as a strategic partner in global affairs. Of course, we were happy also, BRICS and AIP, and, being on climate change and all, we had worked out a partnership. But today, so there was a time, and maybe that is, they've now surpassed that, and we can now see where we now look at our new terms of engagement with China. And just to address the question which many colleagues and friends have said about there being a debate where was the debate really? Nehru was so idealistic. Of course, there was a debate later on how to deal with it in early 50s, when there was a more realistic people and more idealist people. There was never a question. We saw it in terms of pan-Asian solidarity. And there was such a dream about a kind of India and China being together. In fact, if there is a debate, and I agree with Alka and Jayadev and Professor Pant, that was in the 70s when Mrs. Gandhi had to revive to think about opening diplomatic, restoring ambassadorial level relations with China. And then even the Janata government. So despite the Soviet pressure, despite other pressures, she went ahead. But short point being, India, I think, has been clear. India has always wanted good relations, has always wanted engagement with China, and that there has been trust deficit. I guess it has gone. Chinese have felt uncomfortable about the Dalai Lama being in India. We have to be realistic and also, I think, recognize some of these things. But that was still a good basis where we could develop our relation. Now, with what has happened, with China being so powerful and they're becoming unilateral, and even everybody is having today a problem of managing relations. So I think we are right next door. I think if their foreign policy priorities have changed, if their power equations have changed, then they've given it to Japanese. And so that they're very clear, it's a hierarchical order, in regional order in Asia, and there's in the world as well. So for us, I think it's now with the standoff in Ladakh to come to really the bottom line. Thank God the government, the EM has made it clear that for us now, there is no longer delinking of the border and the rest of the relations, which was a template that we worked on in 1988 and which had worked till now. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi has said that no, they have to be delinked and we have to get going with normalizing. How can we? There is anger. There is public anger still. People are feeling let down at what has happened in last summer in the continuing standoff. So as if we are going to, and this is I actually ask all the experts, that are we going to, I hope we are going to maintain this stand, but continue our dialogue and engagement. Minister EM is meeting foreign minister in different capitals on Afghanistan or SEO or whatever. But if we have to be resolute on this, I personally feel this time we should be resolute, I think, that you can't be, you do everything and in the end, EM compares it to a game of chess. I think really our relations with China are like snakes and ladders. I think we do everything and then we come down. So if we are going to go this way, then I think we should be ready that in the foreseeable future, till I don't know what point, it's going to be a stalemate. And we should be ready for that stalemate in that there are two sets of conditions that we'll have to deal with. One, militarily, PLA is now far more assertive at the border. I think India has to be ready for a better military balance on the border. Number two, politically, a new modus vivendi will have to be worked out, in which I think we will have to seek assurance from China that we are not in a state of being permanent antagonistic adversaries to each other, and that can only be achieved. Of course, China should recognize it if it's looking for a global power status more than us, but that can only be achieved if we are able to have a mutually agreed, defined LAC. And therefore, what China has not been very receptive to, that should be India's request, that we should urgently go for LAC clarification. That is the key to long-term stability, and not putting aside the border and carrying on with trade and business as usual kind of thing. Third, on economic and commercial relations, Mohan has said everything that needed to be said, followed by Jaydev and other friends who may have spoken. So I'm not going to speak. I think this is, but we'll have to be realistic. I mean, there is so much of our industry which has been ruined actually, I think, by its over dependence on the Chinese, but there is a lot more which needed, which is mutually beneficial. And if we can rectify some of the kind of policies, structural imbalances, I really strongly believe both politically, militarily, of course, they're superior to us, but politically and economically, we must learn the lessons from the past, I think. We must not really give the Chinese a free run to go and without ever using the leverage of, some accommodation on our core concerns, some accommodation on the LAC clarification or whatever. This is one set of realities, I think, if we go this way. The other, of course, is the asymmetry that we have talked about. And that brings in, long term, there can be no disagreement. It has to be internal balancing, rebalancing. It has to be external rebalancing. Internal, we all know, is going to take forever. Leave out the listing of any kind of issues. It would take very long for anybody. So we have to strengthen our hands and look for friends and partners they are also trying to come to terms with this new challenge. They also have not seen this face of China. So if that is so, why is it? I go back to Raja Mohan and Mr. Pant, I think, and Rajiv just before me. In fact, I should be naming the entire panel, I'm sorry. But I just find we are being so diffident. It is not in our DNA to be going into alliances or continue. And as was just clarified, we are not a small country where boots on the ground are needed that the Americans will come. That's not the argument. What has happened is it may hurt our ego and our self-esteem. China is much too powerful for us to do. Even if it was not as malevolent as it has been of late, it is much too powerful for us for India alone to contain or put up some kind of a reasonable resistance to its unilateral measures that it decides to take. I personally feel we need to engage with China by choosing partners and friends who can help build up in our capabilities, defense, military, intelligence sharing, and so on. And also that we don't have to agree on every bit of the agenda. And why? Look at the Chinese. They built their military machine in the early 50s in the Korean War. Mao got everything from Stalin, later Khrushchev he got. And the same technique he applied with Nixon and Kissinger, and we all know what all they got. So in a way, they were in a kind of a Cold War military alliance without sort of putting their boots on the ground. I think I'm taking time, but to just conclude that, of course, for India, that's going to be a tightrope balancing relations between US and China, but we should be clear what we are doing. I think we should be clear we are doing it to create a multipolarity in Asia, which is what will ultimately go multipolarity in the world. But in this, I think it is both for India and China to try and come to terms that our simultaneous rise can be mutually supportive. And China is a big power, can work out a modus vivendi with India. And India, in its search now, emergence as a power of some importance, must also know that we must stay engaged with China. And terms of engagement must be based on India's national interests, which are then, that is how your bilateral relations template is developed and in global affairs. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, we had a feast of ideas and perspectives. And of course, as we had expected, we've unfortunately run out of time. The one question which is being repeated, which we are getting, is about the US precipitate exit from Afghanistan and how that can be reconciled with its apparent willingness to assume global responsibilities and the possibility that it might have to stand by India if there is a real problem between India and China. So I will just leave that in the air, whether it is a good idea to put so many eggs in the American basket, considering America's present state, its morale, its capacity, its political stamina, etc., etc. But if there is any other question, we can take one more question and then leave it to the panel to decide who would like to answer it. Any other questions? If not, may I?
Can I?
Yeah, Raja.
No, I mean, I think, this question, and there were a lot of other comments. Look, I mean, we seem to believe that others must do the heavy lifting for us, and we won't do anything. Americans must fight till the last American in Afghanistan. Look, it's an unrealistic expectation. I mean, any political judgment would have said 20 years of occupation, $2 trillion, 3,000 people dead of American soldiers. This idea that America must continue to fight in Afghanistan because it suits us. But that's not the way the world operates. Look, we have put no single egg in American basket, but we begin to say, oh, we should not put all eggs in American basket. And I think, look, this idea that, look, everyone is on for themselves. That is the rule number one in international politics. The question is, within that, can we find common ground with different people? That is the question. And that's where the question if we identify China as the principal source of threat, then we work with Americans to the extent that we can. This idea that, look, Americans, they're not, they're being not being reliable. We are sitting with the Russians. We buy S-400 from the Russians. We are in RIC, we are in BRIC. We are not abandoning any of those forums. Germany doesn't abandon NATO just because it wants to build a pipeline with the Russians. So it is going to be a lot of this gray zone. So it all loves multipolar world. We all love multipolar world, but multipolar world will have this many gray zones. But if the US is willing to give us military assistance in terms of our industry, we took 15 years to sign a Lemova agreement. Single project on drones, which the Americans talked about 10 years ago. We need to look at ourselves. Look, this is my interest. Americans will go till this distance, like we say in the old days, in the railway train. Not everybody is going to travel with us. To some distance, whoever comes with us to some distance, we take benefit from them. We give some, we take some. But this idea somehow, someone is going to come and give us a concrete, absolute, lifelong alliance certificate. And then only we will build relationship with the others. I think it's a complete fallacy. We won't give it to anybody. Will we fight for the Japanese in East China Sea? Moment any American say, can you come to South China Sea? We say, look, that's not our problem. Our primary theater is Indian Ocean. But that is the reality of real politics. And is within that can we do things together is the question. And I think that's where there's a lot of room. I think we moved from this absolutist position to more realist framework. I just want to touch on some of the issues that have come up. Neelam talked about, look, talking about, we shouldn't get to the Americans. Have you ever heard the Chinese talk about why Pakistan is so close to the United States? Have you ever heard once Chinese publicly complaining about China-Pakistan relationship? But I think we are into this of debating ideas on their terms. Why are we debating on their terms? They signed in 2000 a strategic partnership agreement with Clinton, in which there's a paragraph on how they will manage South Asia with the Americans. We should not they can't sit on judgment of what we do. They don't tell us what they do with the Pakistanis. So I think we should judge Chinese interests, American interests. Within that, how do we manage our own is the question. Similarly, I think I would agree with Ms. Bhatia that, look, it is not that we will, that wherever Americans go, we're going to fly our flag. It's a question of coordination. Can we work in a way, we do some things, they do some things, but together we meet many of our objectives. And I think that is the question. On the American commitment, look, when Americans wanted to help more in the last two crises on China border, we said, no, we don't want to be seen as being with you in fighting the Chinese. We want to do it on our own. That was our position. So it's not as if we're telling, please don't give us any help. I mean, that was our position, not saying, but then we say, look, what is the guarantee? There's no guarantee in the real life. Pakistan signed a strategic partnership agreement with the Americans in 1954. Did the Americans save them from India in 1971? They did not. So I think it is our judgments we have to make on our analysis and not a priori written pieces of paper that's going to produce security for us. And the final question, I think which Mohan asked about, look, ASEAN is being sucked into a Chinese sphere of influence. You should see here the extraordinary impact of Chinese economic integration with Southeast Asia. Even the closest American partners, Philippines and Thailand, historically the oldest allies of the United States. Today, they're closer to China than to the US. South Korea, a treaty ally of the United States, is closer to China, and it is fighting with Japan, which is the other treaty ally. This is the reality out there. So within this, do we navigate? Do we find some friends? Do we find partners is the question, and not this look for absolute certitudes. There will be no certitudes. Today, US has moved from an insouciant, accommodating attitude towards China to one of confronting. Now, it's not just about military. This is about economic. This is about technology. This is a comprehensive conflict. And within that, can we take some advantage is the question. And not saying Americans must tell us, look, are they going to be with us for the next 50 years? They're not. They're not going to be with anybody. Nobody's going to give a guarantee like that. So therefore, when we talk about alliances, Pakistan, yes, we talk about our strategic autonomy. There's a final point. Pakistan was America's ally, Seato, Cento. But they made a deal with China. at the Bandung conference, PM, and the Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, they come together and say, look, we have no problem with each other. India is our problem. But here we are, putting somehow the theoretical principle rather than seeing how people work within agreements, outside the agreements. And I think it is the pragmatism that we need rather than seeking first principle answers to the challenges that confront us. Let's stop here.
If I may just come in, Ambassador Rajan.
Please.
Yeah, the question on Afghanistan, I think, we have to take some real cool-headed, hard decisions on what our future is in Afghanistan. The situation does not look good for that country, and neither does it look for India in Afghanistan. As far as China, Russia, and Iran are concerned, they are conferring much more with each other on the emerging situation. Of course, Pakistan holds a lot of cards, but I see no reason why we shouldn't be able to calibrate our relationship with China in a manner that it is cooperative when it needs to be, it is competitive when it has to be, and adversarial when the situation demands that, just as Antony Blinken defined what the relationship between the US and China should be. In Afghanistan, I think we really need to make contact and with the Taliban, which I believe the government is already doing. We've been a little late. I remember then Foreign Minister Mr. Jaswant Singh saying a good Taliban is an oxymoron. But obviously we've got over that, and we've understood the need for practical contact and communication. What is our position going to be in that country? We obviously need to build, I don't say coalitions, but build more levels of understanding with other neighbors of Afghanistan. I think we stand the risk of losing whatever assets we built in that country, and they're very real assets. You may argue that the Americans did much more, the others did much more for that country, but the goodwill that we built up, it seems a pity to squander all that away. And we are capable of doing good for that country, but the future remains very uncertain. The other point, like many of the speakers made, was that we have to deal with our internal strengthening, building up our own capabilities. We cannot expect our partners, our strategic partners, the Americans or the Japanese or the Australians, or for that matter, the other countries with which we have good relations, to come to our rescue in pulling our coals out of the fire when it comes to relations with our neighbors. And therefore, we need to build modus vivendi, as Neelam said, with neighbors like China and Pakistan. Ultimately, when I said that we have had 70 years of dealing with the Chinese, I think there are lessons to be learned from that history. What are those lessons to be learned? And many of the problems created in those early years of the relationship have carried over into present time. It's not that we are dealing with new problems. We are dealing perhaps with a completely new, muscular, assertive China. But the germs of that, the kernels of that were very evident even at the time of China's liberation and its early years as the People's Republic. So lessons learned from history, I think, are extremely important. And I agree that, while we take pride in calling ourselves a chaotic and diverse democracy, I think there are a lot of things that need to be much more stable within the country. And one, I think, is really, Rajiv referred to it, how in Parliament business is not able to be transacted because of it's just that the government and the opposition are not able to establish a logic of communication with each other. And how are we going to settle problems with our neighbors if there is no such understanding? I think we really need to see ourselves more realistically and understand where the problems lie. But our neighborhood policy definitely requires attention, and to think that the ASEAN is not going to do anything and everything rests on us to handle the threat from China, I think we are living in an unrealistic world if we think that. How ASEAN looks at China is extremely important, and there's a very nuanced, very sort of differentiated way of looking at the Chinese as far as ASEAN is concerned, you know, it's very promiscuous, as Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan mentioned recently. It's a very promiscuous diplomacy. They stand up to China in some fields, but they also defer to China in others. They understand the economic underpinnings and also underpinnings of history and ethnicity that have brought them together. So where India is concerned, I think we need to be much more observant about the environment around us. And I think perhaps a little, you know, while it's good to be confident and be aware of our strengths and capabilities, but a little less narcissism is also important.
This has been a very, very valuable and sobering discussion. Thank you, Nirupama. Thank you, Raja, and all the panelists. Note that Ambassador Eric Gonzalez is also here. Would you like to say something? It'd be very, very important to hear you, sir, if you are there. No. All right. So,
just coming in. Can I come in for a minute if you insist?
Please.
No, I didn't hear a fair amount of the discussion, but I think that the points that are being made are very, very valid. We are living in a attempted non-aligned world in which we can be friends with some and not friends with some. This, I think, is being pie in the sky. And I agree entirely with what Nirupama and Raja and Neelam have been saying, that we have also to do business with the Chinese to the extent we can. But I think we also must take another book out about the Chinese. The Chinese actually have always taken a lot of more trouble about everybody, even the ones they do not want to do business with, or they want to be against. Even a little island nation in the Pacific or a little thing in Africa, we are always running after the big shots, the Americans, the Russians, the Chinese, and we forget all the little ones. So I think these are all lessons that we have to learn, and we should take them seriously. I'm sorry, I didn't take this discussion too seriously, otherwise I'd have prepared better. But thank you very much for allowing me to listen.
Thank you, sir. I think I give the last word to Mr. Sundaram. Sorry? Anyone else?
Just, I wanted to just a couple of words. May I?
Yeah,
please. No, I thought Nirupama made a very valid and it's an interesting intervention on the fact is that China is actually amongst all three, Russia, Iran. I think China is the best positioned in Afghanistan, though right now maybe things are, Taliban can just go their way. But the way they have kept up their dialogue with the Taliban, first in Mullah Amar's time, and then in the last almost 2 decades, especially when the Americans said that they were going to wind up and go. So they are the best position. Now, the question is, given the strained state of our relations, and it's a very interesting opening that Nirupama is suggesting, if we are really going there on Afghanistan on the coattails of these 3 countries. I don't know of any side or back channels that may have taken place otherwise. The only thing is, Nirupama, I feel that, if they do that, but that's the way you say that promiscuous diplomacy, then maybe if we get a little bit, at least an assurance that don't unleash them on Kashmir and India as you do, stop them from Xinjiang, or they might ask for a pound of flesh on what's happening on the border. But then that's the give and take of diplomacy. But the idea, if there's anybody today who's in the panchayat, it is the Chinese. And let them just pretend and say, bhai, sab peaceful karo, ye karo. They are in, I think, on all the deals, but Raja is looking at me. I think he will know better, I think, or Harsh Pant. And if Harsh Pant is there, I want to make just half a second. And if he has left, then I want to just say, but Mohan said he's not a sinologist. Harsh Pant said he's not a sinologist. And it is Harsh Pant who wrote a lovely article. These days, everybody's a sinologist in Delhi. So that's where I think China is. But anyway, today we have the real sinologists on this panel. Thank you.
But Neelam, to take you up on your point, I just wanted to quote from what Sumul Sinha, who used to be our consultant in Lhasa, said.
Yeah.
when the Chinese entered Tibet, and the quote, was that, if Pakistan was spoiling for the fight at the same time that China is antagonistic to us, I think that's an advice I think we should ponder over. These are his exact words. We can't, like the Japanese General Tanaka, boast that we can fight Pakistan with our left hand and reserve the right arm to deal with those who may seek advantage of our difficulties, unquote. I think
Yeah.
I'd like to leave all with that.
Okay. I've suddenly become a hardliner, I think, after all the years of my romanticism for China. So, but I take your point. I take your point. Okay.
Yes, I think that is the mood on which all of us will be ending this session. Thank you all. Stay safe. Mr. Sundaram, the last word is yours. Would you like to say something? Sundaram? No. Well, thank you, everyone. God bless everyone. Thank you. Stay safe. And look forward to being in touch. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Take care.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Ambassador Rajan. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirupama. God bless.
Oh, Mr. Sundaram is there now. Sundaram is there also.
Come,
Okay.
Sundaram. See you, please, please.
Bye, Nirupma. Bye,
Bye,
Mohan.
Neelam. Take care.
Lovely to see you and hear
Lovely
you.
to see
There's
you.
no time to discuss, but we should do it maybe again. Huh?
We should
Lovely.
do. When I come to Delhi next.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Ambassador Rajan.
Bye.
Thank you.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye. All the best.
Bye.